Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by and welcome to the Dorsey and Whitney's Energy Industry Group webinar, How to Prepare and Enforce Cybersecurity Threats. During the presentation, all participant lines will be in a listen-only mode. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded today, January 19th, 2016. I would now like to turn the conference over to Robert Cattanach, partner in Dorsey's Regulatory Affairs Group. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have, I think, what will be a very interesting and very timely program for you today. Again, I'm Bob Cattanach. I co-chair our Cybersecurity group here at Dorsey and Whitney. With us on the program are Michael Gomez, who is a partner and principal at KPMG. He offices in the Washington office, and Ron Plesco, who's a principal and national lead cybersecurity investigations, who's in, I believe, Philadelphia this morning. I think Ron's actually in San Francisco. So I would ask just for a moment if Michael could give us just a little bit of his background, and then Ron.
Thank you, Bob. Michael Gomez. I am actually out of Annapolis, Maryland, and happen to be in San Francisco today. My background is a number of years in the cybersecurity business, almost too long to really identify how long I've been doing it, but I have done some work with Homeland Security as well as some of the other three-letter agencies, and then most notably taken responsibility for KPMG's energy cybersecurity business. Ron?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Bob. Ron Plesco out of Philadelphia. Thanks for the introduction. Look forward to the webinar today. My background, similar to Michael a little bit, used to work for Governor Ridge, stood up the National Cybersecurity Division at the Department of Homeland Security, working then with three-letter agencies on cyber threat intelligence sharing. Came into KPMG about 3 years ago after running a global nonprofit that looks to share cyber threat intel amongst U.S., non-U.S. companies, about 2,000 of them. Three-letter agencies, U.S. plus 34 countries, law enforcement intelligence community. What I do for KPMG is to the left of incident, cyber threat intelligence, and to the right of incident as part of KPMG cyber, digital response, cyber investigations.
Thanks, Ron. Just an advisor to those that are on us, with us on the webinar. You may view the PowerPoint slides if you go to the Dorsey reminder email that was sent out earlier today and click on the web link. And also, if you wish to submit a question, and we encourage that you do feel free to do so, please email at the dorseyu@dorsey.com, DORSEYU @dorsey.com. I think that's also in the reminder. So with that, I think we'll start it off with Ron. Ron, can you talk a little bit about the vectors of the threats that you're now seeing in the industry?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. I think probably a good way to back into that is to look at what's changed over the last 10 years, if you will. I've been involved in this space for about 17 years, and if I go back about 10 years, we had the threat actors of yesterday being really disorganized. Criminal groups, though they were organized crime, they weren't necessarily working together. Standalone threat actors that were going after, in essence, targets of opportunity. And looking at the demographic that's on this call right now, we've got heavy concentration in energy, public waterworks, et cetera, as well as financial. So I'm going to tailor my comments to threats in those spaces specifically, but I'm happy to broaden them a little bit. But if I look at back 10 years ago, it was all about targets of opportunity. Really taking things down, theft of any services that were of value, and identity theft. If I look to a pivot point that occurred in the industry, it probably occurred back in 2007, 2008, when the threat actor groups, especially organized crime, and I'm going to get into those groups in detail, as well as nation states, started to diversify. So just as you'd hire KPMG or Dorsey to do some work for you, the underground, if you will, established itself pretty readily in 2006, 2007 to start offering diversified services, hacking services, money laundering services, software, malware malware writing services, etc., to sell those services to other criminals, threat actor groups, etc., worldwide. And that really started 2006, 2007. So that pivot point occurred where the threat actors realized that there was a lot of money to be made from a cyber crime or cyber threat standpoint, and they started to offer services to each other. And what I'm talking about right now is the genesis of what is known as the black market or the cyber underground economy, and I'll be talking about that in some detail in the next couple slides. But for this slide today, what I'd like to focus on is, okay, who are these bad actors from a organized criminal group, nation-state group, hacktivist groups, and what are they doing today, and what are they going after? And to get into that into some more detail, it's really a target of choice. Strategically, they're working together to then tactically go after specific targets that are going to make them money. So, Bob, if I could ask you to move to the next slide, please.
Sure.
I know there's a little latency. While the latency happens in the slide change for those of you following along at your offices or at home, we did put out a lot of read-ahead materials that were part of the email that was sent out to you all for this webinar. I'll ask you to please refer to those afterwards or during this, as a lot of them are pertinent to this discussion today. So, taking what I just said from a targeting standpoint, you have these threat actors on the left side. So think of it as threats to what are they going after. So from an organized crime standpoint, if I break up the world into segments, with the fall of the wall in the late 80s into 1993, overnight you had the largest single intelligence gathering apparatus in the history of the world, that being the Soviet Union and their nation-state spheres of influence, go dark, meaning the largest both signals intelligence, hacking intelligence, if you will, gathering capability, as well as spy intelligence gathering capability, overnight went dark, and in essence got usurped into organized crime communities in a lot of the Eastern European nation states. A good read on that is Misha Glenny's book, known as that is entitled Big Mafia. So if you think about what I've just said, you had the rise of organized crime in the 90s and early 2000s, only to move into the internet and cyber crime in mid-2005 all the way to the present day. So what are those groups doing, and who are those groups? When we speak about those groups, we speak about them in terms of Eastern European as well as Russian, Romanian. These aren't necessarily the nation states doing that, but I'll come back to that in a minute. It's more the organized crime groups inside of those countries that are doing nefarious things and coming after data of the folks on the phone here, of our clients, Dorsey's clients, etc. So what type of data are they coming after? Really, it's anything that is seismic, that is fungible, anything that can make them money. So of course it's information assets such as PII, personal identifiable information, name, date of birth, social security, healthcare information of anyone on this phone call. Even though you might be in the energy sector, you have employee data, you have potentially customer data, you have healthcare data. All of that has a fungible value in the black market. So organized crime groups, whether they be Asia Pacific based, Eastern European based, etc., are going after that data. There is also a black market for merger and acquisition and commodity data. Why? The ability to influence or short or buy a stock before it's released, going after financial reports of some of the corporations that this has been made public about last fall. This bracket for this type of financial data has been in existence for a little over 5 years. Specialization occurs from Eastern European organized crime, trafficking in this data and selling this data. What am I talking about? Hacking corporations and stealing their pre-release financial data, going after the weakest link third-party vendors that may or may not have access to that type of data, and also merger and acquisition and transactional data that would be of value that could influence the street value of a traded commodity of a corporation that might be on this phone call. So with that, from an organized crime standpoint, Think about them as anything that is fungible that can make money. All the data on the right side, legal dispute data, your financials, everything that I talked about has a fungible street value. I can get into the unique values, ask questions about that. I'd be happy to answer that. But I'd like to move on to nation state. From a nation-state standpoint, Night Dragon and other examples that arose out of China over the last 4 or 5 years, and if you happen to catch 60 Minutes this weekend, there was a big story on 60 Minutes related to intellectual property theft by nation-state, China as a nation-state, and their work with organized criminal groups inside of China and outside of China. So why nation-state and why corporate espionage related to nation-states? A lot has been put out there by the CIA and the NSA inside the United States, as well as the current FBI Director Comey, former actor FBI Director Mueller, and others, related to the targeting of U.S. interests, Western countries' intellectual property by nation states, especially China and others. The idea there being that there is a value in your secret sauce, how you do things, and from an R&D cycle perspective, if you can steal that information, if you're a nation state and share that with the corporations inside of your country, you can then jumpstart the R&D cycle that you would have, and thereby be quickly or more competitive than U.S. or Western countries, companies that are selling products, services, etc. in a similar space, basically hacking intellectual property. So state-sponsored, it started down that path. Now you see state-sponsored also include taking information not only in intellectual property, but how energy sector, other sectors work, how they run their systems, just in case that information would be needed as part of a information operation or an information warfare attack, an attack on a nation state such as the Ukraine by Russia that we've seen this year and a couple years ago as well, going after their critical infrastructure. So corporate espionage, I've represented some clients that have had competitors globally hack them and try or attempts at hacking them, or either via insider threat actor or wholesale hacking attempts at hacking them from the outside to steal their intellectual property or disrupt their services. That's corporate espionage. Hacktivist groups. These are groups such as Anonymous, splinter groups off of Anonymous, Lutzig, and others that are going after you simply to make a political statement or because you're in an area of business that they disagree with. You have Anonymous has done operational green ops, environmental operations to take on companies that are on this phone, as well as some large agricultural companies based in the United States that sell products that they disagree with. Then we get into, not on here, but cyber terrorist groups. You've had funding by some nation states in the Middle East to Syrian and Jordanian cyber terrorist groups. Well documented is the attack that those groups did against Saudi Aramco. That attack involved pieces of malware going in and bricking, if you will, non-technical term, for taking over and disrupting over 70,000 of their machines, their desktops, laptops, etc., in one fell swoop, with the intention of taking out their oil production infrastructure and having that blow up. Though that issue never arose, they were able to successfully take those machines out. That, if you look at the research on that, that traces back to cyber terrorist groups. Last group that I talk about here from a threat standpoint is the malicious users or insider threat. So from an insider threat perspective, countless examples related to that, but it's still, to this day, 60% of these types of issues arise internally, if I look at Poneman and Symantec's research from last year. So if you think about that and think about the information assets that are on the far right that you're trying to protect, you've got almost this perfect storm, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes, that's happening. Because of this threat picture, you've seen huge increases in the insurance market. The insurance market for cyber insurance from last year, about $1 billion in cyber insurance being issued last year. The market's expected to grow in the next 5 years to $2.5 billion. So, Bob, if I could ask you to go into the next slide, please. So as we transition, how big is this? Well, if I look at all the research, every year, vendor research, the slide you have in front of you has a Symantec call-out box from Symantec Corporation on the right. All the other corporations, Trend Micro, McAfee, Kaspersky, and others, all put it at anywhere between $350 billion to $500 billion a year. Forbes, in a recent article just before the holidays, looking back on 2015, has said that annually cybercrime costs the world economy about anywhere from 400 to 500 billion. Lloyd's of London tried to put an estimate on this last year. They put it at 400 billion. All these figures I'm putting out there for a reason, and the reason is that the industry itself is not very forthcoming industries related to cyber threat and cyber attack. So the ranges that you hear, the Wall Street Journal ran an article last year of this is just at 100 billion. Ranges that you hear from 100 billion all the way to 500 billion of what does this actually cost in cybercrime are wholly dependent upon self-reporting by corporations, by victims. A lot of this goes underreported. Why would it go underreported? A myriad of reasons, but from a reporting standpoint, if all of you got hit today with some of the attacks that I'm about to talk to you about, once it went through, you'd look at what your legal obligations are related to reporting. You'd work with your attorneys, hopefully Dorsey and others, to figure out what your notification responsibilities are. A lot of companies, they find themselves in this gray area where PII or PHI is not being taken. So do they have a duty to disclose, go to law enforcement, go public with this? And so it's within that gray area that you see this wide range of what the actual costs are to the economy. One study that I looked at in preparation for this is a Juniper research study. If I look at 2013 and 2015, cybercrime costs worldwide have quadrupled. Going the next 4 years, 2015 to 2019, those same costs are expected to rise to about $2.7 trillion. So by 2019, this research indicates that we're looking at about $2.7 trillion in cybercrime costs to the worldwide economy. So if I can ask Bob to go on to the next slide, please. So, back into who's doing this. From a who's doing this perspective, 80% of this is coming from organized crime rings, according to research done by IBM, and that's what's on the screen here. So if I look at that and I say, okay, 80% is organized crime, well, where are the nation states from a threat standpoint? What's happening in the space is the nation states are using the diversified underground that I talked about to do this type of targeting and attacks. The organized criminals have set up pieces of malware, sell pieces of malware, sell an infrastructure to deploy these types of attacks, known as botnets, etc. So nation states, to hide themselves, are using that infrastructure that organized crime has stood up as well. And we call that a false flag or a red flag. Well, what does that look like? So the underground itself, if I would go into the underground, and I spent a lot of my career in that underground, running that nonprofit that I talked about, the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, of which I'm today the interim chair of the board of directors. If I look at that and ask Bob to go on to the next slide, if you go out into the underground in all different foreign languages, threat actors are selling access to information. And one is that, of course, is not classified. This is from a couple of years ago, but it will give you an idea of what's out there. This is a Romanian organized crime underground chat room. About 40,000 members worldwide of this underground chat room. The Romanian organized criminal groups, up in mid-2007, 2008, 2009, all the way to 2010, the concentration was really on financial data, stealing usernames and passwords for bank accounts, credit card information. There's a good read in Wire magazine about this called Hackerville, one of the cities in Romania concentrating solely on hacking. It's a good read if you want to look at it to give you a perspective on what the Romanians were doing. But really then a pivot point occurred. Anything that was fungible was beginning to be sold in the underground, and that's what this is representative of. This is allegedly an advertisement. This is actually an advertisement of allegedly a water treatment facility up at in upper state New York. What this is a Romanian organized criminal selling, claiming that he has access to this SCADA system, supervisory control system, ICS, industrial control system interface for this water treatment facility. And in having this access, he's now selling it. If you go to the next slide, it's pretty telling how he's selling it. In advertising it to anybody that would want to buy it in Romanian, basically claiming that if you buy access to this, you can change the chlorine level, the fluoride level, etc., and have a detrimental impact on that area and impact on the life and safety of the citizens in that area. So, look at this. Is that probable? Well, that's actual. What I'm showing you is actual screenshots from a Romanian underground from years ago, and again, it's not classified. But if I look at the history of this and say, okay, has this taken place in the past? All you have to do is look to the history of just the water industry. We'll go into the energy industry in a couple minutes. If I look at the history of this, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where I live, in 2006, a foreign hacker penetrated the water filtration plant. Didn't do anything, but penetrated the plant. This is all publicly available. Wastewater systems throughout the United States have been penetrated. Some of the wastewater has been dumped. And this is 2000, 2006, 2007. Nuclear power plants have had issues in that same period of time. So Big F as a worm came out, infected some of those power plants, etc. You had some controls at the Hatch nuclear power plant, Browns Ferry power plant, Davis-Basie nuclear power plant, etc. Davis-Basie in 2003 getting hit by the slammer worm. And then you had different Olympic pipeline and different companies with their pipelines getting hit because of problems with their systems and systems having overloads. So if I take that in context, 2005, 2006, 2007, it's not that much of a stretch for the Romanian organized crime to then be selling 2008, 2009, etc. access or alleged access to ICS or SCADA. This issue, them moving into this pivot point that occurred in the black market, was really a wake-up call to law enforcement, intelligence community, and the corporations globally that heretofore the threat actor groups that were going after PII, PHI, financial data, etc., to make money. Now we're looking at other ways of making money and selling access to that. So if I can ask Bob to move to the next slide, please. So, well, what's this mean to you all? And if I just pick up the news over the last couple weeks, really all of last year, these two threats were pretty paramount and will continue to be in 2016 and into 2017, in my opinion. These two threats that a lot of you might have seen already. These come out of cases that our team here at KPMG has dealt with. And both of them are contextualized and thought of by the FBI and others as these two high-level areas. One is called business email compromise, BEC. Another is called ransomware. So let me talk to you about BEC. You probably have seen this. This is a Nigerian organized crime movement with some other groups worldwide. It makes them a lot of money, and this is why they're doing it. They send, at its lowest level, it comes in the form of an email, pretending to be from the CEO. So how do they do that? They just change the domain ever so slightly of the email that's coming in. So just imagine I was the CEO of any of your corporations. My first initial, my last name. Let's just say your corporation's name is XYZ. They change it to just xy.com, drop in the Z. Something as simple as that to get through your spam filters, to send you an email, to ask you to send a wire transfer. They do their research, though. They spend a lot of time on your websites, publicly available documents to figure out who your heads of procurement are, who your C-level folks are, who your board members are, to then either spoof their email or either hack their email, actually hack it, and send an email from them asking you to send a wire transfer. A week does not go by that our teams do not get 2 or 3 calls with something like this. Most recently, a client called us just day before Christmas Eve, having 1.2 million transferred. Our largest we've seen is close to 10 million in wire transfer because of BEC. So BEC would continue, and this is not a hacking attempt. This is a social engineering attempt and spear phishing, trying to pretend that there's someone they're not to get you to rely on the email to pay wire transfer, ACH transfer, transfer and perpetrate a fraud. The more unique ones that we're seeing is they're going after your third-party vendors, and they're actually hacking your third-party vendors and changing the ACH transaction and routing codes of your third-party vendors. You think that you've paid your third-party vendors. In one case, we've got a client somewhere in the world over the last couple of years. They thought they paid a couple $100,000 to their third-party vendor, 10-year relationship with that vendor, only to find out that the third-party vendor never got paid. After an investigation, the third-party vendor realized that their system was hacked, procurement routing was changed in the transaction routing code of the wire transfer, and our client was out a couple $100,000. The third-party vendor never got their money. So BEC is interesting and will continue. Ransomware. What is ransomware? In essence, just imagine if you all went into work tomorrow and you had this pop-up message that is on the right side basically saying all of your files are now encrypted. Please pay this ransom, X amount of money, usually under $10,000, to release all the files. This is a piece of malware, a piece of code. There's organized crime groups that are making so much money off of this. FBI has warnings out there related to this. New variants of this. Last year was Crypto Wall, Crypto Locker. There's new variants of this right now. They're going to be targeting you and coming after you. Why? Unfortunately, an FBI agent said publicly in early December that the FBI recommends that you pay this ransom. The FBI has pulled back on those comments, but the issue is they can not necessarily do anything about the encryption and to decrypt your files. Imagine if you came in tomorrow and all your files are inaccessible. None of your machines work unless you pay a $10,000 ransom. There's stories throughout the internet. Please go out and search them, where you'll see most corporations are actually paying this ransom, including government entities as well. This will increase this year just because of all the money that's being made related to this. So if I can ask for the next slide, please. So what we have, in essence, is this perfect storm that I talked about. One, a growing threat level that's ever-changing. Just as you watch the Weather Channel to see what the weather is tomorrow, all corporations on this phone call have to be aware of who's coming after them, how they're coming after them, and how that's changing. You also have a changing technology landscape. You have bring your own device at work. You have different devices coming in. You have employees taking their devices home and realizing that the device that's issued from work isn't as good as their home machine, using a USB drive to move files from one to another and maybe cross-infecting the machine. You have cloud dependence upon third-party providers such as cloud, managed security, changing that technology landscape, as well as compliance pressure, always reactive, never proactive, but pressure nonetheless. Moving into the next slide, what this gives us is these 5 high-level trends, if you will, that are taking place in the security arena. One, I talked about the external threats. Changes in the way that you have to do business, rapid need for technology change, regulatory change that I'm going to leave more towards Michael and Bob to talk to, and of course the change in market needs and the need for everyone on this phone call to do more with less. And does that mean outsourcing security, cloud providers, etc.? More to do more with less to make more money, so your CapEx and OpEx related to information security goes down next year. So that sort of leaves us in this strange state, and I'll ask for the next slide, please, of confusion. And this is usually where we kiddingly would say, okay, just call Dorsey or call KPMG and we'll help you out. But this leaves a lot of our clients in this totally confused perspective, if you will, or orientation. They're not sure what to do. This has become a top-of-house issue, meaning I spent a lot of my time talking to boards of directors, risk committees, audit committees, etc. How do you put together an overall risk governance structure to handle this? Michael's going to be talking to all of you about that in a couple minutes. And then how does that translate strategically down to the tactical to do things internally? Next slide, please. A pivot point occurred in the industry a couple years ago, and that pivot point followed on the heels of CIA Director Panetta, Robert Mueller, FBI directors, and others moving from the perspective of it's not a question of when, it's a question of if. That was 5 years ago. To where we are today, and the pivot point is you have to assume that you are hacked. Most companies that are in this space assume that they are compromised. One of the board I sit on with John Stewart, the CISO globally, the CSO globally of Cisco Corporation, the hardware manufacturer. John said publicly a couple of years ago that any moment in time, 18% of his network is potentially compromised. So you have to assume that you're compromised, understand all the threats, understand your attack surface, and what products you have to combat that. And you don't do that just in a moment of time. You have to do that 24/7, 365. So that's where the industry has moved to, assumption that you are hacked, prevent them from getting to the seismic data that I talked about earlier. So where does that leave us? And that takes us into the next slide. And I think this is where I teed it up nicely for Bob, and I get to hand it over to Bob. So thank you.
And we'll go back to Robert Mueller, the director of the FBI, who it's sort of now become almost trite to say this, only two types of companies that have been, those that have been hacked and those that will be, and now they're converging into one, companies that have been hacked and will be hacked again. It is an unfortunate reality of our world. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, which shows incidents by industry. I will make my slides available afterwards if you would like to see these. But I do think it's helpful to see that, for example, we just have the utility industry boxed here highlighted. Is it a huge number of incidents compared to, say, information or retail? No. But it is significant, and of course the stakes are very significant. I think as Ron mentioned earlier, right now we're seeing an increased focus in data breaches on the healthcare industry, because that's where the money is. The value of a stolen credit card today is actually going down. The value of healthcare information, which can be misused in a lot of ways to generate funds, and it's all about generating funds, is going up. The energy sector is an interesting one, and we'll talk about that just for a second, because it represents two different opportunities for the threat vectors. One is obviously the sensitivity of the grid and the energy infrastructure is huge, and everybody knows that's in this space that is being probed all the time by the bad guys. Not necessarily to bring it down. I think there are reasons why that doesn't happen, even though potentially it could. But there is another important piece to this on the energy side, and that's just the bread and butter stuff of customer accounts, employee information. That's going to still be of great interest, independent of the sensitivity of the grid. And talking about that just for a moment, the average cost of a data breach, $6.5 million. That's probably conservative in the sense that if you had to add all the internal time, it would potentially be significantly higher. That's going up in a rate of 11% this last year. The average cost of a stolen record is a couple of $100. If you talk about several 100,000 stolen records, which I think is typically the case, that's real money. And obviously, the cost per stolen record is going up. The consequences are self-evident, but I think it's worth saying out loud. The importance of the energy industry to our national security is impossible to overstate. And obviously, it hasn't gone unnoticed in Congress. There's all sorts of federal bills that are getting introduced on this. There are some minor changes that have been enacted, but I think this is one of the few areas where there's true bipartisan support and concern for improving the ability of the energy sector to identify and respond to threats. And I think there's going to be an increasing demand for accountability by the regulators in this space. So I'm going to talk just for a couple minutes now about some very basic principles. I'm going to guess that everybody on this webinar already knows this. the reason I'm going to spend some time on it is because it has to become part of the company's culture. It's not just we have IT doing some things, or we have an awareness program within the organization about spear phishing. Don't open up attachments. This has to become ingrained in the culture of the organization, and it probably starts with a core group of people, and there's got to be a focus on what's our data, what vendors do we rely on that have access to our data. Probably the most important thing anyone can take away from this call is the value of an incident response plan. Again, I'm guessing everybody probably has one somewhere. How robust it is, how practiced it is, may be a different issue, because it should be practiced. And Ron's point about cyber insurance, I think, is a very helpful one, because that sector right now is clearly responding to a perceived need. And I'm going to talk about that later, but I think let me preview of the use of cyber insurance. The allocation of risk as between a vendor and its customer often is asymmetrical. The vendor may get some amount of revenue by providing a service. The potential risk associated with a breach of that vendor is magnitudes higher than the risk of the customer. So how does that get dealt with in a relationship? Typically, it will be negotiated, but no vendor is going to want to be on the hook for millions or tens of millions of dollars for a contract that's worth $100,000. That's where cyber insurance really comes in. And I'm going to hold for a moment on getting deeper into that, but keep in mind that as we try to structure how we operate on a day-to-day basis to deal with the cyber threats, the vendors are key, and cyber insurance coverage from those vendors is also important. So going back to information governance for a moment, this is not something that can be left to IT. I think the training sessions that I'm sure KPMG does, that we do at Dorsey, tries to branch out into a fairly broad array within the company, particularly in the C-suite. And we're going to talk about involving the C-suite in a minute. But, just the basics of knowing what data is being collected, who has access to it, and why they have access, should they have access, how long is it being retained, and why is it being retained. Mapping the flows is a really helpful way just to get a grasp of what all data exists within an organization, why it exists, and where it's going and why it's going there. An information risk management program is essential. I know that Michael's going to talk a little bit about some of the things that companies can do, but the hierarchy of identifying what data is really important, because we can't protect everything all the time. And I think, as Ron mentioned, you just have to assume that someone is going to be inside your systems. And so detection and monitoring are as important as the perimeter defenses. The other thing that's really helpful, and we'll talk about this a couple of times, is documenting the process. Why are we doing this? What are we doing to make sure that we are where we need to be? If it has to be written down and ultimately accountable to the board of directors and senior management, documenting it is probably the best way of engaging the responsible people to do that. The vendor situation, I think, is increasingly difficult. It used to be called third-party risk management, and I'll explain further on that in a second. But because it's not just your vendors, but your vendors' vendors. So it could be third-party risk management, fourth-party risk management. How deep do you go? You should know, of course, who's got your sensitive data, what IT vendors, what professional service providers have it, independent contractors and temps that may be on site. So that's the obvious focus. But perhaps not so obvious, but getting more attention is, what are those vendors doing to make sure that your data is as safe as you believe it should be? And typically, When a vendor is retained, it's because there's a relationship with the company and there's been a historic one. And so the retention comes first, and then the questions come about, well, what are you doing to protect our data? I think industry is beginning to reverse that process. They want to know, first of all, what that vendor does to screen the staff. How do you get onboard and offboard procedures verified? Where is the data being kept at the vendor? Is it going to be stored outside the U.S.? How does the encryption work? Is it just encrypted at rest? Is it encrypted at transit? The importance of intrusion testing, security certifications. More and more vendors are recognizing that it's not enough to represent and warrant that we take best practices security efforts to protect your data. Companies are demanding, properly so, let us see some certification, let us see some verifications. More companies are having on-site visits and audits of their vendors. So the thought here that I'd like to leave you with is, how do you deal with who bears the risk? Clearly, you can make an obligation to the vendor to secure your data. That vendor will go up to a point to commit to an indemnification. And then how do you retain the title to that data, including de-identified data that could be re-aggregated? I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes about the incident response plan. Again, probably everybody on this call knows of an incident response plan. The plan, of course, is important, but what's more important is the process of developing the plan. If you engage the key sectors within the company, and they're listed here, IT, information security, risk management, legal, customer service, public relations, it now becomes something that people take ownership in. They're conscious of it. It's not just a function that's relegated to someone in IT. And the team leader may be someone in IT, but the escalation process is also very important. And as that team is formed and as responsibilities are assigned, an equally important process as well, at what point does it move up the hierarchy? At what point do we engage the C-suite? At what point do we engage the board? And there are just some basic steps that are critical to keep in mind. It's not just who's on the team, but who's their backup? Where's the contact information? And I can't overemphasize the importance of practicing the plan. I've done many of these. I'm sure Ron and Michael have too, where you get people in the room and go through the exercise. You can start with the tabletop exercise, just so people get the feel of it. It does a couple things. It makes you better at what you're doing, but it also keeps in the consciousness of the people that are on that team, we really need to pay attention to this. And then it becomes, again, ingrained in the culture as they go back to their direct reports and talk about this process. I think it's also worthwhile as you get more sophisticated and more mature in your incident response plan to start involving third parties. No one likes the thought that they're going to expose potential weaknesses even to a trusted third party such as your accounting firm or your law firm. But that may be one of the best ways to get an accurate gap analysis of where couldn't we do better, and we must do better. And if there's one thought about an incident response plan that bears repeating, it's a continuous improvement process. This next slide just shows some of the basic things you'd want to be thinking of in that first 24 hours. I will go through them fairly quickly, but the importance of documenting everything can't be overstated. You should have step number one, a documentation progress, a login process. Who discovered the incident? Interview that person. Log what was said. Record the date and the time when it was discovered. Then when did you activate the response team? What is being done to secure and preserve the data? All of these items should not only be executed, but documented as to why it was done and how it was done. And then there's always a challenge, and at some point, maybe Ron, you could jump in and talk about the tension between really knowing what's going on, but also being aware of do we really have the threat vector eliminated? Because it's in that fog of breach, so to speak, that you don't really know how much penetration has occurred, whether they're still in, what can be done to verify that the threat vector has been closed. I think we'll go through the rest of the slide very briefly, but it's difficult to take a deep breath in the middle of a breach and say, all right, are we satisfying the protocols and the priorities that are called out in our incident response plan? But that's an important step in the process. It's really easy to just get your head down and try to get everything controlled, but you once in a while have to take a deep breath and say, all right, let's just confirm, are we where we need to be? One of the other issues that I think is always going to be a challenge is whether or not you notify law enforcement or regulators. One thing I'd like to mention, and it's just anecdotal, and I'll ask at some point Ron and Michael to give us their thoughts, but one thing that frankly I'm seeing personally is a different calculus by the industries out there that they're revisiting the question, do we really have to notify? I'll get to a notification slide in a second, but a lot of times you don't know for sure whether data has been exfiltrated. And I think we went through a cycle where if there was any hint of a data breach, people went public. They probably in some ways may have overreported the severity because they didn't want to be accused of not knowing what happened, so they would kind of do a worst case scenario. We're now sensing, again, this is anecdotal, there's some breach fatigue going on. And I think there are some executives that are saying, if I'm not sure the data was exfiltrated, I'm not necessarily going to go out and scare all of our customers with yet another breach notification of them from one more company. And there, you will see in some of the incident response requirements, there is the ability to do a risk assessment. It has, in fact, it been demonstrated that there is a risk of data being actually compromised. Spending just a minute more on cyber insurance, I would encourage everyone on this call to have a discussion with their risk management group and say, how did we get do we have cyber insurance, number one? And how do we know that it's the kind of insurance that we need? What are the coverage grants? What are the exclusions? There are an enormous variety of products out there. It's a very competitive market. A lot of coverage is being sold. Some of it is probably decent. Some of it is not, candidly. The grant of coverage is very narrow. The exclusions can be very significant. But the risk management folk may say, well, we have cyber insurance. What else do we need to talk about? So I would really suggest that that be carefully looked at. I have here, and again, I'll get a copy of the slide deck out with this slide in particular. But this is in the Sony Corporation breach, the first one of the PlayStation network. They try to get insurance coverage, and the New York Supreme Court said that no, the coverage you have actually doesn't cover this thing because it's coverage for what you do, not what some outside third-party actor does. So there are certainly legal risks out there with that you have to be aware of if you have data breach issues. If you say we take best practice efforts to protect your data, and you say that on your website, and you get hacked, there's a pretty good chance the Federal Trade Commission is going to look at whether or not you were in fact living up to the commitments that you made on your website about what you did to protect your data. And if it's a major incident and the FTC concludes that you really weren't, you were just saying that you were doing these things, but you really didn't do them, at least to their satisfaction, you could easily be the focus of an unfair trade practice claim by the FTC. The SEC is getting more and more aggressive on the disclosure requirements for data security and reporting. It is important to remind everyone that there is no single federal breach notification law that covers all breaches. As many of you know, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act covers financial institutions, HIPAA covers healthcare institutions, but other than those two industry segments, we're left with a kind of hodgepodge collection of state data breach laws. I think there may be now 48 states that have them. Each of them can be a little different. As I note here on the slide, if your data is encrypted, you may not have an obligation to report that breach, unless, of course, the code got hacked as well. Some states will allow a risk assessment threshold, and if you can conclude that there is no real risk that the data was exfiltrated or will be disseminated, then that would not require reporting. Some states, as many of you may know, their breach notification laws cannot be reconciled with other state breach notification laws. Massachusetts is one of the classic examples. So there is no one-size-fits-all to a breach notification if you have customers that may be located in many different states. One thing to keep in mind, the state attorney generals are becoming more and more active in this space. California in particular is that attorney general has made it one of her pillars to be very aggressive on state consumer protection laws. And will assert extraterritorial effect. Just a data point, but it's worth noting, is that if you have the misfortune to have a data breach and you're starting the process of what do we have to do by way of notification of our customers in various states, some of the states require that you notify their attorney general prior to the time you notify any customers. So, and I'm sure KPMG has this as well. We have a live database here at Dorsey that we update on almost a daily basis as to what the data breach requirements are for each state. So if, gosh forbid, something happens, we can immediately access, all right, what's the current state of the law in any particular jurisdiction, and make sure our clients are in compliance with it. So I think that ends my part of the session. And Michael, I'm teeing it up for you.
Thanks, Bob. And before I jump in talking about a framework for cybersecurity oversight, I would just like to make a few comments specifically on data breaches. And in looking at who was attending the call today, I noticed that there were people from compliance that were going to be participating, as well as regulatory, legal, and IT. And I also noticed that the majority of you were either from the energy industry and several from the banking industry. And so a lot of my comments certainly will be more aligned to the energy industry because that's pretty much the predominance of players I'm going to be working with. So I'm going to ask Ron to jump in as he sees fit to try and add some color, certainly around my comments on creating a framework that might be relevant to each of you in these other industries. But as far as data breaches goes, right now within the utility sector, there is an annual requirement in both the state of New York and California to do an audit based on NIST 853 controls on how PII data is not only stored but then also used, as the case in California. So states are taking certain steps to protection of data, but traditionally we have not seen, whether through NERC CIP or any IDO 9 within utilities, and certainly not within the oil and gas sector, any requirements, specific requirements as it relates to protection of data. So the controls that most of these entities are using are really based on NIST or other frameworks that are out there. So Ron, before I jump in on the security oversight, any additional comments you want to share on data breach?
No, I think we're good, Michael.
Okay. With that, Bob, why don't you go ahead to the next slide? So in looking at how to build a program, we look at it in three different directions or three different ways. The first is implementation components, which are inclusive of operations, technology, and human factors. The second would be under planning and control, which would be information, risk management, business continuity, and crisis management. And then lastly, the foundation. So how are we going to support these other two areas of our program? Certainly leadership and governance, and then legal and compliance. So I'm going to go through each of these and provide a little context. And so how about you go to the next slide, Bob? In working with our executive clients, and specifically in presenting to the boards, what we find most of the time is that they have three different questions that they always ask us when we present to them. And I'm going to read them. And so if you follow along, please, have the slides in front of you. Please do certainly follow along. And the reason why I'm reading them is because I want you to envision yourself hearing these questions. And certainly if you hear other ones, let me know. But these are the predominant ones that we hear. First is, what are the new cybersecurity threats and risks, and how do they affect our organization? And this is certainly something that most CEO and board members, they continually hear about data breaches. They continually hear about what other peers in the industry have had happen to them. But the context is really understanding the type of industry that you're in and the potential risk. So we're going to go through it as I go forward in the document, sharing a little bit about what some of those ways that we can educate the board are. But the first one certainly should resonate with most of you, that question. The second one, is our organization's cybersecurity program ready to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow's cyber threat landscape? Certainly what Ron talked about early in the presentation, there's so many different threats from so many different angles. It gets back to what is the most likely risk that's going to be associated with our environment. Because if you really try to protect yourself against everything, it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy that you just will not be able to do it. So a defense in depth strategy that focuses on those items that are most relevant to your world is something that we see being successful, or at least as successful as can be. And then the third question is what key risk indicators should I be reviewing at the executive management and board levels to perform effective risk management in this area? So this kind of ties everything back together that I just talked about. And so in creating a framework by which to evaluate and present to boards, KPMG came up with 6 different areas of focus. And I'm going to go through each of them, but understand that these areas of focus were really derived from multiple frameworks in the industry, whether it's NIST, ISO, ANSI, SANS, etc. So this is not something that KPMG just took upon itself. It's something that we leverage the control frameworks that exist in the industry. Some of you, whether you work in the utilities, work with NERC CIP. Some of you may work with NIST 853 controls that you've created. But regardless, I think this framework really is comprehensive and will give you a good understanding of one way that you might talk to your executives. And so in looking at the framework, if you could go to the next slide, please. There's 6 different areas that we focus on. And if you'll notice in the middle, it says board engagement and oversight. And around it, these are the areas of focus: leadership and governance. Next, human factors. Third, information risk management. Fourth, business continuity. Fifth, operations and technology. And 6th, legal and compliance. And so we believe in looking at each of these areas, you would have a comprehensive understanding of your environment. And a lot of times we would recommend that people also do maturity assessments based on these 6 areas. Now, once again, if you are in the energy industry, you have a C2M2 framework for both oil and gas and for utilities that a lot of you have used to measure maturity. And I would tell you that in each of these 6 areas, you would be able to put within the 10 domains that are part of the C2M2, and it fits in quite nicely. So let's go and actually do an evaluation of each of these and also look at how you would communicate with the board and then also communicate with management. So please, Bob, to the next slide. The first piece is leadership and governance. And leadership and governance is defined as management demonstrating due diligence, ownership, and effective management of risk. So when boards want to get engaged, they want to know several things. Now, I would share with you that each of you may have boards that are more engaged than others as it relates to cybersecurity and have more experience. So depending upon the level of experience your board has, some of these may not be relevant to you. And I would state, though, that some of them absolutely are. So, for example, the first one is understand governance structure and meet executive leadership team. We've worked with some of the largest companies in the world, and we've also worked with some of the smallest companies in the world. And what we've found is as it relates to governance, there may not be a common way in which cyber is communicated in the organization. So each time the executives would go and meet with the board, they would be communicating cyber threats in a different way, and that all causes confusion with the board. So understanding a governance structure that meets the leadership team. So you educate the leadership team on exactly how you're going to be defining the risks associated with cyber, and then continually updating it. Now, I would warn you, the second item, review output of capability assessments, that can be dangerous. And I'm sure many of you that have had to present to your leadership a capability assessment or a vulnerability assessment or the findings, you can get a lot of different types of questions. And a lot of times what we see is that when you present these types of assessments and the results from the assessments is that you may get a panic attack. And that's really not what we're looking for. What we're looking at, once again, is educating and actually causing maybe a cause of action, but certainly not a panic attack. The next items that you see is review and approve strategy, which is certainly extremely important when you're looking for funding requests, because these programs, as you know, can become quite costly, specifically talking about NERC, SIP, and NEI 09. Participate in general board education, and lastly, request periodic updates of the program. So if you notice, all of these, with the exception of the capability assessment, are creating a common platform by which you're going to be communicating what the cyber risk is to the organization and how you're mitigating those risks. And so how should management do this? Management should define program ownership and governance structure. Second is identify sensitive data, assets, and critical infrastructure. So what this means is that you're changing the paradigm by what you're talking about. The second bullet point is sensitive critical data assets. Ron talked about Night Dragon, and for an oil and gas company, its most critical assets is certainly its IP on how it's bid and then how its technology works. Critical infrastructure certainly goes then to both not only oil and gas, chemicals, infrastructure companies, and certainly utilities. Next is, I think what you'll see more and more of going forward is an inventory of third-party supplier relationships because of the threat that they pose into the organization. Right now, the only construct that really looks at the supplier relationship and certainly risk management is NEI 0809. And if you're familiar with that requirement, that is what the nuclear industry is using. So I know Bob had just pointed out today that there was an article in the Washington Post talking about how secure the nuclear industry is around the world. But the reality is every nuclear facility around the world, with the exception of the United States, does not have a framework. We do have a framework, and in fact, it is quite a broad framework, and I'll talk a little bit about it a little more. But the reality is certainly I think you're going to see more and more focus on inventory of third-party supplier relationships. Who has information that's critical of mine, as well as then what technology they're putting into my environment. And I think if I remember correctly, Ron talked about Cisco, and I'll ask him in his final comments just to talk a little bit about all the threats that Cisco has, and of course the threats that they then have to mitigate as they put the technology into their client's environment. Next, define a strategy and approach, and lastly, educate the board and executive management. Possibly the most important thing that you're going to take away from this slide is to continue to educate the board, the executive leadership, on exactly how you're going to define the risk of cybersecurity, how you're going to manage that risk of cybersecurity, and then certainly how you're going to respond to that risk as it happens in the organization. Next slide, please. Human factors is something that I would share with you is probably one of those threats that we are going to have the hardest time mitigating, and largely in part because bad actors inside your organization, there's really no stopping that. But what we can do, on the other hand, is we certainly can work with our organization to ensure that we understand where the threats are coming from. And I always tell this story, and I'll just take 2 seconds of your time, but the reality is I was with one firm at one point in my career, and we did a spear phishing exercise, and the way we worked it was that we sent people an email asking them or notifying them that they were to receive a new monitor, and just click on the link to schedule a time in which IT would come up and install their new monitor. Anyone who clicked on the link without forwarding it to the help desk, because they didn't notice it necessarily didn't come from the right group within the organization, had to take a class, a 2-hour class on cybersecurity. I'm not looking and suggesting punitive measures is always the right answer, but what I'm suggesting is that email actually snagged the CISO of the organization. Because even at times, I would tell you that the people that are most stringent and ardent on security, they may overlook some things too. So creating a culture by which security is so built into everything that you're doing can't be underestimated the importance to it. So set the tone for culture at the top is what the board should be focused on, understanding training and awareness protocols. So what should management do? Define culture and expectations, define talent management and career architecture, and then lastly, develop specific learning paths for key personnel. So I really do believe that I think it was Bob who talked a little bit about the culture and the importance of the human factor as it relates to cybersecurity, but I think you're going to continue hearing that, as spear phishing is probably, and Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, the largest and most influential way of penetrating a company.
Yeah, you're spot on. And that's that business email compromise is a good example of that.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Next up, information risk management. If you wouldn't mind changing, thank you. Bob, and Bob brought up a lot of this, and this is really, once again, gets back to the data breaches. Ron also talked about Night Dragon. We don't necessarily see this as much in the utility sector, the theft of information risk management. May that change? Sure, because of what the records that most utilities keep of their clients, but we have not seen it to the large-scale attack. What we've seen in the utility is the notifications really around ICS, industrial control systems, BES assets, as they're known. Certainly in oil and gas, once again, it's the IP. So we do see that in that situation. What steps are we taking? So how should the boards get engaged? I would say the first bullet point probably is the one that I would focus on, is understanding risk management approach and linkage to enterprise risk, which means that enterprise risk is something that the entire organization needs to think through. It's the framework by which you protect all of your assets, and certainly around your information technology. Next, understanding third-party supplier program. We talked a little bit about that. Review and question program metrics. How are we measuring our success around enterprise risk management? And then how should management communicate to the board? Develop risk management approach and policies. Secondly, identify risk tolerance and communicate. So those are the areas around risk management. Let's move forward to business continuity. Next slide, Bob. So business continuity, and I think Bob did a really nice job in talking about the incident response programs. A few additional comments that I would share with you is that utilities themselves in the energy industry have done a phenomenal job. They've built their businesses on business continuity. The lights go out, we respond quickly, we bring your power back up. But in working with most of the utilities that I have at the C-suite, I will tell you that they are not prepared for a cyber attack at the C-suite, meaning that how do they communicate to the industry or the environment that they've been penetrated, they've been attacked. They can manipulate how many different things. They can say there's outages. They can manipulate where trucks are going. There's a lot of different things that I would tell you that most boards, most executive level, and certainly the C-suite would not know how to respond to this. I've done these before, and I can tell you that if you've not done a cyber incident response, not only plan, but also an exercise, it's an eye-opening experience for your executives, one that I think you would gain a lot of value of. Looking at the overall industry specifically to utilities, if you're not involved, there's certainly exercises called GridX, which is how the overall industry would respond, and it's run by NERC. I know a lot of you have probably done that before. It's a wonderful exercise. It's actually taken from Homeland Security Cyberstorm. And so Cyberstorm is how Homeland Security responds, and then ultimately what the utility industry did was to model that and create what's referred to as GridX. Now, the difference between utilities, oil and gas, and other industries is that utilities would work together in the case of being attacked, business continuity, namely taking down the grid, work together to bring it back up, and you would certainly see where oil and gas companies and a lot of the other industries, whether it be banking or healthcare, it would almost be like themselves. And so it's obviously I understand the nuance behind it, but I also understand obviously the risk that's associated with it. So Ron, this is probably a good point for you to bring up. Any examples that you've seen as it relates to business continuity that you'd want to share that you would think are best practices for any of the other industries that are on the phone, whether it be banking and or health?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to go into those, and I'll definitely go into them in detail in the last couple slides that I have on when incident response fails. But as far as best practices, I think Bob said it earlier, and I'll go with an Eisenhower quote here. Planning is okay, but practicing is everything. And you can have the best plans in the world, and there's some great examples related to this that are out there. You've mentioned some of the DHS guidance. There's other guidance out there. Healthcare space has gotten religion over the last year and a half related to some high-profile incidents. Retail space as well. Financial space and oil and gas space has really led the way in how to do incident response and incident response planning. I'm going to get into some of the details here in a couple minutes, but I'll hit you with one of the things that was on Bob's slide, and that is what's become the norm is to have a couple companies on call, not only companies like ours and law firms like Bob's, but realizing and looking at a legal review of all documentation related to breach and incident response as it relates to third-party and third-party vendors. So that niche right there that I just talked about, you'll be surprised a lot of the legal language that's in the third-party vendor agreements does not require those third-party vendors to notify you, the company that's buying their services, whether cloud-based or others, if they've had a breach. A lot of our clients are going through reviewing all those with counsel, such as Dorsey, and making sure that those are changed and altered in those agreements so they get the notification. So another best practice is on having 2 to 3 firms on call to do incident response, as well as 2 to 3 law firms. Why? Because of all the third-party vendors, some of the law firms, some of the incident response companies like ourselves might be conflicted out because we might already be doing similar work or conflicted work with the third parties. So back over to you, Michael, for the rest, and then I'll jump in to do a little cleanup on how incident response is failing.
Sure. Thanks, Ron. So we just have 2 more areas to cover, and then I'll turn it back over to Ron to talk a little more in depth about what happens after a cyber intrusion happens and occurs. Operations and technology. What's interesting about this, and specifically in the energy industry, is over the last couple of years we've seen certainly the convergence between IT and OT technology. And one of the ways that we're going to be able to manage this is creating a control structure. And a control structure can be any type of framework that's in existence, whether it's be NIST 853, whether it's NERC CIP, but it's adhering to the control structure, evaluating security. And I think, though, it's important to state, and I either could say it now or when we get to the compliance stage, but I'll say it now, is that security does not equal compliance and compliance doesn't equal security. I know many of you have heard this, a lot of people say that, but that's just the reality behind it. And that IT and OT assets need to be managed or at least evaluated for their risk based on a control structure. So then what would be the board's level? What would they want to know? They'd want to know what is the maturity of the control structure. And then lastly, the bullet point that I would point to you is meet with a CIO or equivalent to understand the integration of cyber and information technology trends. And so, you know, that goes to the IT assets, but I think it's equally important is to bring in the OT assets. I was asked in a panel last week whether or not the CISO should report to the CIO or directly to the C-suite, and I think it really depends on your organization. It's just not a clear-cut answer. It's truly what are the types of assets that you have in your organization, and then how do you align those into a reporting structure and a governance structure. So some utilities I've seen have it, some oil and gas companies I've seen have the CIO have responsibility for OT assets, and others I've seen a CISO that reports to the C-suite. So I'm not advocating for one way or another. I think it's just an evaluation of how your company is aligned. And then certainly what should management do? Select and implement a control framework, which is I think we just hit on a little bit. So last slide around legal and compliance. Next slide, Bob. All right. So I think we've certainly talked a lot about the legal component to this. And Bob, thank you for those very valid and helpful comments. I think what we certainly see around legal and compliance is working with your audit committee. For those of you that are engaged with NERC CIP, you understand the enormous grand scale effort it is to be compliant coming up on April 1st, 2016 for your high and medium BES assets. These are things that I think are not going to go away, whether you're talking about NERC CIP or NEI, whether or not the chemical industry and the oil and gas industry ultimately bring in similar type of compliance frameworks is yet to be seen. There's a lot of discussion in Washington one way or another. For the other industries, I would certainly tell you that there's a lot of pressure on the Hill to create a regulatory framework. But once again, it gets back to, even if we had a regulatory framework, would that improve our security? Where should we focus our time is ultimately what some of the people are talking about. And then we've also talked about cyber insurance, and Bob had some excellent points on that. If you had an opportunity to read the book Lights Out, there's a specific chapter that's written about cyber insurance in the utility sector, stating that if threat actors actually took out the power grid, would cyber insurance cover the utilities? And the answer is no. And the reason why is because that would not be what would be part of your cyber insurance. And so if you are looking into cyber insurance, be very granular as to what is covered and what is not, so you're not put in a bad position of not knowing what's covered. So let me go to the last two slides, and if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So let's go to we already talked about how should the board get engaged for each of these areas, but how does the board gain comfort? Certainly there are different ways that each board can become comfortable. I think truthfully around leadership and governance, capability mature review output is certainly one way as it relates to doing a maturity assessment and reporting out on the board on where things stand and where things lie. So I would tell you that's important. Certainly around human factors, trends related to cyber from whistleblower ethics hotline. Certainly a good way, but I think probably the largest thing you can do is percentage of employees, contractors attending training. I mean, continuous training is certainly one good model to do that. Information risk management, I think all four items are very valid, specifically risk tolerance measures and metrics. Next item, how should the board get engaged, specifically around business continuity, number of tabletop exercises, number of mission-critical business processes with plans in place. Both, once again, excellent initiatives that I would highly recommend. Operations and technology. It says percentage of crown jewels assets included in monitoring coverage. Sometimes it's very difficult to do that, but still I would tell you that the reality is understanding what those critical assets are is the first step and most important step. Understanding your assets and understanding the universe of those assets. And the last thing we talked a little about, once again, is the cyber insurance and certainly open regulatory and litigation matters is how often and how many you get engaged with. So those are my comments. I'll turn it back over to Ron to close this out, as long as I think Bob's got some departing comments as well.
Sure. Bob, if I could ask you to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And thank you, Michael, for the transition. And while we transition to the next slide in the presentation, one comment on training. Training last year on IT security globally, $1 billion was spent on training for security awareness worldwide. And that training was to educate on cyber threats, behavior related to it, and hopefully to reduce the number of breaches. Bob, if I could ask you to go to the next slide. Or maybe I'm not seeing it. So this is a key risk indicator framework. A lot of companies have this. I just wanted to tee it up as a sort of a basis for some of the stuff Michael and Bob were talking about. So if you just think about what your key risk indicators are, I think all companies know their company best. They'll bring in firms like ours, Dorsey, and others to help them with this. But what are those thresholds as it relates to cyber? It's always funny to me that in the physical world, we can all say what those thresholds are, what they look like, what kind of risks we would tolerate, at what point we would escalate those risks, and who owns those. For some reason, the word cyber gets in there and information security comes to play, and all that key risk indication goes out the window and how folks think about it. So if you think about that as a process, I would get into the next slide, please. Bob, thank you. And I'm going to give you sort of the top ways. My teams have had the luxury or lack thereof to investigate some of the worst breaches globally in history over the last 4 or 5 years. All the ones that you've read about, and probably more importantly, the ones that you haven't read about because they haven't been reported. And so we've sent out a white paper to everyone, and I'm going to highlight out of those top 10 what I think really are the top 5. Because if you think about incident response and some of the comments that Bob made earlier, what is that tension between the board during an incident and the CIO, the folks that are working the incident, there is a great tension there. And if I think about incident response, that's a function within an organization that is responsible for really assessing the integrity of the people, the process, and technologies that enable the business operations, that enable your businesses. When this integrity is compromised in any way, it's the incident response team's responsibility to evaluate that impact and provide decision makers, whether that's mid-level management, the C-suite, and even the board, with the necessary information to make informed business decisions. The incident response function usually is charged with containing and remediating the breach of this integrity, as well as identifying failure of controls and recommending improvements. So Bob went through this, and I'm going to stay at a high level, but if you think about what I just said, the incident response team, whether you all have your own teams or you rely on third-party vendors like our KPMG, our competitors, as well as our legal counsel, you all have teams to deal with that. When and where you bring them in is all part of your incident response plan. What's not clear in a lot of corporations is how that works. Because if failure to detect if and when this integrity, you've been compromised, or how do you respond to it appropriately, if you fail that way, then your incident response function itself has failed. So as management looks to mature this function, whether from the C-level down, risk committee, audit committee, et cetera, down, it's important really to understand the primary challenges facing incident response teams today. And that's why I put together this list. So if I look at the first challenge is really the team. Well, who is the team? I think if any of you would take your playbook off the shelf, if you don't have one as you're drafted one, you would want to concern yourself with who should be part of that core team. I've written many incident response plans for our clients, reviewed their plans. Usually it falls into two buckets. They have a tactical plan that the IT team with the Security Operations Center has that escalates up to CIO, CISO, etc. And then there's the executive level team that gets involved at some point. But what I've seen, though, from a teaming standpoint is that the incident response team actually lacks the proper balance of skill set, size, and management oversight. Depending upon the size of the organization, small organizations, they're faced with very limited security budgets, and they don't have the proper people or response-focused individuals. They have folks that are responsible for running the networks, maybe not folks that are responsible for incident response. So they dual task those individuals. Some of the individuals that work those, running the network as their day job, they're very highly skilled in all their fields, but the issue is they're not highly skilled in incident response. So how do you put together the right management oversight for those type of individuals? The industry turned a couple of years ago to bringing in third-party vendors, and also after an incident, bringing in another company to evaluate how your team responded to the incident in what is known as a IV&V role, independent verification and validation of the investigation that was done. So with that in mind, what I'm seeing is the team themselves don't have the right skill set, might not be the right size, whether that's contract or non-contractor based, and they don't necessarily have the right management oversight. Bob, to the next slide, please. So the second way that we've been seeing that these are failing is process, and Bob brought this up. I've been involved in a lot of incidents, and during the litigation after an incident, things such as process, the plan itself, are subpoenaed, whether by state attorney generals, by plaintiffs' counsel, etc. Though I'm an attorney, I do not practice law for KPMG. I maintain my license as a former prosecutor with a concentration on cybercrime, privacy law, national security law as it relates to cyber and intelligence sharing. So if I look at process, what are we talking about here? I've seen companies write their plan, and their plan doesn't get updated for years. That is fertile ground for subpoena or discovery request. The procedures themselves aren't then related to or tailored to the organization, because in years the organization has changed. So these processes that I'm talking about, the incident response program needs to have a solid foundation based upon actual operational processes of the organization. This is not a once and done endeavor. You have to look at your incident response plan annually. Some companies look at it quarterly to see if it needs to be updated based upon position title, processes, policies, business operations, etc. And to the next slide, please. The next area is tools. The incident response plan and the folks that are doing incident response usually don't have the adequate tools to manage to run the incident. I've been in companies where the tools themselves were purchased 3 years ago. The one individual that was part of a five individual incident response team that knew how to run those tools left the company. Here the company made a $1.4 million investment in some best-in-class tools, And when they had their incident, nobody knew how to run the tools that they had. So in that case, the tools were, though adequate, they were unmanaged and in this case underutilized. Or in some cases, I've been in companies that they don't even have the tools. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about, you can take our white paper, look at that. But really, the issue is what do you have in place right now to contain an incident as it's happening and to mitigate it? Bob said, and I'll echo this, the fog of an incident or the fog of war, you will not know what the cause of an incident is within the first 24 hours or 48 hours. Heck, I have a client right now, 2 years past an incident, they don't know what the cause is. But probably the most important piece that I'm going to impart to you today is this, number 4. Most companies do not know where their data is. They think they know where it is, so I challenge all of you on this phone call, whether you're in IT or not, to go to your CIO or your CISO and ask this simple question. Please give me don't ask for a network chart. Give us a diagram of where our data is and how our data flows throughout the corporation, including third-party vendors such as cloud vendors, et cetera, and procurement and how we set up our procurement systems. I have not been involved in an incident where the client has known exactly where their data is. They think they know where it is. It's only during an incident that we find out that the data is not where they think it is. In some cases, they thought it was in the United States, only to find it's in a secondary or tertiary cloud provider outside the United States, impacting, of course, different laws from different venues worldwide. And last slide, please, Bob. Politics. Incident response, everyone, it's an all-hands-on-deck issue. And I've seen incidents where the chairman of the board is trying to run an incident, the CEO is trying to run an incident. These are unfortunate when this happens. Figuring out those politics prior to what role does the general counsel have, crisis communication, etc. Planning related to that and who owns what is key. I've seen incidents try to be quarterbacked by various levels of the organization, and in all cases, those types of incident responses fail. So incident response teams are tasked with assessing the integrity of an organization and responding appropriately when that integrity is compromised. While the pattern for success is unpredictable and it's ever evolving, organizations can distance themselves from failure by laying down a solid foundation of procedures and policies on which skilled professionals can base their performance going and their duties. Having that plan and understanding what that plan means. By leveraging the right tools to compile all the relevant data in an expedited manner while an incident is taking place, an incident response team will then contribute to the success of the organization by mitigating and containing the incident. So with that, happy to turn it or go to the next slide, please.
So I'm hitting these as we go along, Ron. Go ahead.
Just build it all the way out. What this is to show is really from an Internet of Things standpoint. I sit on a government and private sector working group, U.S., non-U.S., defense sector, as well as intelligence. And what we're looking at is where are we in 2020. My working group looks at 2025 and 2030. 2025, we're expecting 125 billion interconnected devices. Put another way, where we are right now is 98.8% of the world is yet to be connected. We've only connected 0.2%. If you can go to the next slide. I guess the good news, bad news in the next slide here is security itself is always going to be an issue. Next slide is not coming up. Not sure why, Bob. Here we are. We're at the end. Security, good news, bad news is security is always going to be an issue. It's not necessarily job security for all of us that are attending this webinar, but if you take some of the approaches that we've talked about, I think, and encapsulate them into your overall approach, definitely manageable. We are at the genesis. As we roll out into Internet of Things, we are at the genesis of this from a risk governance perspective as well as an incident response perspective. So I'll turn it back over to Bob for some closing remarks, and I wanted to thank Dorsey for putting together this webinar today.
Well, and thank you, Ron and Michael, for what was just a terrific presentation, at least from my set of eyes and ears. I will close it out with one more sobering thought. I'm sorry we haven't heard a lot of good news here today. Other than I think it is good that people are becoming aware, institutions, of the importance of going through the processes that all three of us have talked about. I'll leave you with one thought that I think is useful. In addition to the challenge we all face, things will go wrong, unfortunately, just the way life works. And when we talk about the boards, and all three of us talked about the importance of having the board engaged. I'm a litigator. That's what I do for a living, and I'm watching some of the officer and director litigation right now. The Wyndham board was sued for that data breach. They dodged a bullet there. It's not clear what's going to happen on the Target data breach. But remember this. It's all going to be viewed in hindsight. After something goes wrong and the plaintiff's lawyers show up, they're not going to talk about the 99 out of 100 things you did right or the board did right. They're going to talk about, well, look, the board was presented with the status and the gap analysis, and they were told that things had to be done. Why weren't they done sooner? Why wasn't more money spent? Everything that will happen after the fact will happen with the aid or the curse of hindsight. And that's why the documentation that we've all talked about of what are you doing, why are you doing it, have it all documented is critical so that when someone is judging it by hindsight, they can say, well, they were paying attention to this, they did document it. And the last thing is, some of these things you might want to think about conducting under the auspices of attorney-client privilege. Ron's correct. They're going to try to get every piece of paper that ever was written on this, but end of the day, if you had some privilege for the purposes of providing legal advice and some of the materials that go to the board so that the board could do their job, there is, I think, a reasonable hope of getting it protected in the event, unfortunately, of litigation after the breach. So we're done for today. Thank you, really, for listening in, and especially to Michael and Ron for some very insightful and informative materials and presentation. And we will be sending you a thank you. And I think my slides will be as part of that. I would encourage you to look at the white papers that Ron put together. They're very helpful, and it's really worth your read. So I think that's it for now. Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the conference call for today. We thank you for your participation. Have a great rest of the day. You may disconnect your line.